All right, so we are here to talk about recruiting, hiring, and retaining faculty and staff of color, some strategies that I have found successful in my experience. So before we get started, I wanted to share a little bit about who I am and how I'm showing up in front of you today. So I'm from the Boston area. My parents are immigrants from India. I went to Harvard. I studied African American studies there. It was a way for me to study race and racism before, the college had more ethnic studies. And I went to law school. I went to Yale Law School. I graduated in 2002, and I spent the next 15 years working in nonprofits, mostly around issues of immigration reform, criminal justice reform, and public education reform. As part of my work with immigrant rights nonprofits, I did a lot of dialogue work. And so you can see this picture here is a picture from an annual conversation on race that I hosted when we lived in Atlanta. And about 200 people would come and have a conversation about how to build King's vision of the beloved community here today. And so it was really that dialogue work that brought me into equity work. And so this idea of bringing people together across their differences to be in conversation, to address conflict, and to build understanding and connection between people. And it was really that nonprofit background that I brought into serving as the director of diversity and inclusion at two different independent schools in Baltimore, a K through 12 girls school and a K through 12 Quaker school. And in those schools, I was fortunate to experience a lot of success in hiring faculty and staff of color. And I just wanted the opportunity to share what I have learned and welcome you all to share your expertise and experience as well. So in the chat, just so that I can hear what in particular you all are interested in getting out of this time that we have together, would love to hear from as many of you that are willing to share. What challenges do you experience in recruiting, hiring, and retaining faculty and staff of color? So you can feel free to put your comments in the chat or unmute yourself and share. All right, so from Colette, getting diverse applicants. So even seeing people, faculty and staff of color applying to the job. From Annie, BIPOC faculty and staff feeling tokenized in a predominantly white setting, right? So dealing with culture, issues of trust and belonging once people are actually there. Knowing which hiring conferences are best, absolutely. And around policy, how to craft hiring policy to make sure we are casting our net wide. Also, what implications that has legally, absolutely. So those are excellent questions. Strategies for recruiting a more diverse pool, excellent, because we know that the research shows that the more diverse our pool is, the more likely we are to land the candidate. Beyond just simple probability, that it actually exponentially increases the likelihood. Some people don't see faculty diversity as necessary, right? So what is actually the benefit of doing this work? Getting the school to focus on equity and inclusion and not just getting the numbers, right? So that, yeah, absolutely. So it's one thing to land the candidates, it's another thing to shift the culture at school. And how do you really move the needle in school culture? How to get more white colleagues to feel a shared responsibility for shifting culture. Yeah. So thank you for sharing those thoughts. We are going to be addressing almost all of those issues in the hour we have together. The one that I'm probably not going to address as much is the why, right? So why is it important to have faculty and staff of color? I think that research is out there. It has been well documented, the role of that faculty and staff of color play in the lives of all children of all races, and what a difference it can make to have a diverse teaching staff. And so I'm not going to cover that research in our time together, but I know that is definitely out there. And so I'm going to assume that we all want to hire and retain our faculty and staff of color. So I'll share some strategies that have worked for me. All right, so with regard to the hiring process, I'm going to talk about it in 3 different stages. The stage of recruitment, the stage of hiring, and the stage of retention, right? And not necessarily that it's a linear process, it's more that all of those things are happening all of the time. With regard to recruitment, one of the things I'd really like to highlight is the ongoing nature of recruitment. So you are always in recruitment mode. Everywhere you go, whether that is, after COVID, like out for lunch with your partner, whether you're on a walk, whether you are attending a party, wherever you are, where there are other human beings, your mind is always focused on, is there an excellent teacher that I could recruit to my school here? And you're always willing and ready to have that conversation, because really you can meet people anywhere you are. The other aspect of this being ongoing is that you're not necessarily waiting for a position to open up, right? We know that eventually a position will open. And so when you meet someone who's an excellent candidate, you can begin the process of recruiting them, of being excited about them, of trying to get them interested in your school, even when no position is open. And so I have found that the schools who are willing to have their division head or a colleague, a colleague teacher at the school, or a department chair, or a director of teaching and learning, or a director of faculty, um, uh, uh, coaching, that those groups of people should be willing to meet and have coffee with, or have Zoom meetings with, or conversations with excellent candidates way before a position will be open, because it just takes that long to recruit them effectively. With regard to hiring, I think one of the things I would like you all to focus on is that bias is always at play. So when we think about implicit bias, we know that our brains are wired to put things and people into categories, right? That is just the way our brains work. We have a flood of information coming at us all of the time, and our brain is like a computer that takes that information, puts that information into categories, and then takes action. So for example, with regard to it, we can walk into any room, and if we see a chair, even if we've never seen that particular chair before, our brain takes information about the shape of the thing, puts it into our brain, and spits out, that's a chair, you sit on it, and we know what to do with it. The where we can get into trouble is that our brain does this with people too. And so at all stages of the hiring process, whether that's resume review, interviews, campus visits, we know that bias is always at play. So it's not if it's at play, it's that the acknowledgement that bias is playing a role, and the question, how might bias be at play here? So that awareness is critical. Retention is the final thing I'm going to talk about. And I think there the critical word is around support. So we know that the typical tenure of faculty and staff of color at independent schools between 1 to 3 years, right? So if you do all of that work to recruit and hire, only to have people leave, and now if they leave for a better opportunity, for a growth in their career because it's the best thing for everyone, that's one thing. If they leave because they are unhappy, because they do not feel valued, because they feel that who they are is not welcome at the school, it's an indication that the school has much more work to do around shifting culture and really building that culture of support for employees that they bring in. So that is a little bit of an overview. I'm going to start with recruitment. So when we think about recruitment, here are some of the things that have worked for me. One is around personal relationships. So who do you know that may be able to help identify candidates? So what are your networks? How can you always be talking about this? And really looking into your personal networks in order to recruit people who are looking. And so the thing is that people are always looking for a good opportunity, right? They want an opportunity that will be good for them and their own career advancement, for their families, that would be in alignment with their values. And so using your relationships to begin to identify those people. One of the questions was around like what conferences are really helpful around doing this, you know? And so one of the things around challenges with some of the diversity conferences, although, you know, I'm sure many of them are probably excellent in many ways. One concern that I have heard about some of the diversity conferences is that there aren't very, as you know, many teachers and faculty and staff of color who attend, right? And so for me, it was always helpful to identify the conferences that are particular to faculty of color. And so the one that I am aware of right now is in Atlanta. It's Teachers of Color Fair in Atlanta. If you look up TOC, they have an Instagram page, they have a website. In a I think everything's online this year, but in a normal year, I would attend their conference every year in Atlanta. It would be around September. And it was all faculty and staff of color who are looking for jobs in independent schools. And so there you have a plethora of people who are exactly who you are trying to recruit. Another thing that I have found helpful at the schools I worked with was hosting an educators of color fair at your own school. And so this is something that, you know, we did at one of the schools I worked at. When in the first year with kind of limited planning and recruitment, we had 40 or so people come. We certainly were able to have some of those people in our candidate pool and end up as part of our teaching staff either that year or the following year. Um, and so what that looks like is just, you know, having an evening at your school where it's kind of an open house for potential educators of color. And how I structured it was having people, faculty and staff of color at the school already, as well as all of the division heads, the head of school, the director of teaching and learning, the assistant heads of school, talk about, to share a story about what they love about working at that school, right? And so it was a really beautiful evening, a very touching and moving evening where you heard person after person share a very poignant story about why they love their school and why they would recommend this school for other teachers of color. And so what it does is a couple of things, right? It signals out to the world that you are a school that is looking for faculty and staff of color. It signals to the school a little bit, I mean, it signals to candidates a little bit about what the culture might be like, and that there are other people there who have that ability to talk about what this means to them to be a teacher of color at that school. I think existing networks for me have been very helpful. So I think the POCC withdrawal social media groups have been a great place to post things. There are local people of color organizations in every region of the country. There are DEI email lists. And so talking to the diversity practitioners in your lives about those lists and how to post jobs in specialized lists. Another thing, a place where we posted jobs and were able to have some success was attending HBCU job fairs. And so, you know, our local HBCUs held job fairs where you could have a table and share about your school, made a relationship with people in the education department at the different HBCUs in the area and say, you know, we are looking for faculty of color. If you have people that are excellent, if you have people that are looking to student teach, we would like to be a place to host them. And so using those networks as well. Another thing that just a little bit different than recruitment, but that kind of fits there, is that even when there isn't an opening, we were able to create a fellowship program that would allow people in the community to teach 1 or 2 courses at the school. And that was a way that we were able to diversify the teaching faculty, even though there wasn't money for, a full program. And it was a way for people to get in the door so that once there was an opening, they would know the school, they would know the children, and they would be already beloved members of the school community. I think another thing that I have found really helpful with regard to recruitment is making the case. Everybody wants to feel needed. Everybody wants to feel special. Everybody wants to feel like you want them in particular. And people will consider jobs that they were not considering because they are moved and excited about the potential, the brilliance, the power, the beauty that you see in them. And so I can share story after story of people that I met, in the airport, anywhere, where you could tell they would be an excellent educator because of their characteristics, and just like really sharing that with them and sharing why you really need this person and their energy and their perspective and their experience at your school, as well as thinking about what you can offer them. So one of the questions I often ask candidates was, what is your greatest hopes and dreams for yourself in your career? Because I want to be part of supporting you to reach that. And everybody wants a mentor. Everybody wants someone who is a cheerleader and who is on their side. And so when you're aware of their greatest hopes and dreams, you can really be part of making that come true for them. With regard to hiring, a few things I wanted to share is what I talked about earlier around being aware of bias, right? So bias is always at play in resume review, in interviews, in reviewing the model lesson, and in whatever social activity you engage in the campus visit or taking the candidate out to dinner. I've heard a lot of comments that expose bias, right? I've heard comments about, a person who went to an HBCU and wondering whether that was a real university. I've heard comments about after taking out a candidate to dinner and saying, well, I just can't see myself having a beer with that person, right? Which isn't part of what we are asking them to do, right? We're asking them to teach 3rd grade, not for you to have a beer with them. And so those are ways in which bias can creep in. And so all of the same strategies that work with reducing bias work here. One is working through scenarios, and I'll share some examples of those in a minute. 2, reducing bias is around like having training around that, becoming more aware of your biases. And so one way to do that is to, take the implicit association test at Project Implicit at Harvard, begin to understand more about your own biases and understanding how they might be at play. I think the other thing is simply asking the question during every resume review, during interviews, how might our biases be at play here? And I'll share a little bit more about reducing bias as well. We also know that bias is most active when we're hungry, when we're tired, when we're rushing, when we're moving quickly. So how to move a little slower, a little bit more deliberately, how to incorporate whatever it takes to slow your mind down and really be able to be present for this. I found it helpful to tailor the campus visit. So, we are recruiting this candidate as much as, we're evaluating them. And I think that is a shift for a lot of independent schools, right? So a lot of independent schools might feel like, wow, it would be an honor for anyone to work here with us at our school. I think to land faculty and staff of color, we have to shift from that perspective to more of a recruitment. What is good about our school to attract you to us? And so part of that is understanding a little bit more about what the candidate cares about and connecting them with some of those people when they come to visit. So, we had parents of young children affinity group. We had students of color affinity group, parents who are of adopted children, lots of ways for them to connect with other people on campus so they can learn more about what community is available to them. Around creating policies, and I know that was a question at the beginning. For me, we have to have clear written policies, protocols, and practices around hiring, right? This cannot be just, people's, just like a way we've always done things, right? So how do you create professional hiring teams where everyone is trained? Creating hiring goals, right? And somebody had a question around legality. And so having some goals around having your faculty reflect your student population or reflect the region in which you live, all of that is completely legal, right? That is different than the kind of illegal discrimination that we are talking about. And so we need to have some goals for accountability. And I think one of the easiest goals is around having the faculty reflect either the student community, if that's diverse, or the metro area, wherever you are. Creating policies around finalist pools. So there's some research from the Harvard Business School that talked about how simply having two of whatever marginalized group that you are targeting in your pool dramatically increases the chances of landing that person. So they found when there were two women in the finalist pool at university searches, that it was much more likely to actually hire the women. The same thing with people of color. And so having at least two people of color in your finalist pool does seem to make a difference. Having one seems to allow people to more often not choose them because psychologically they believe, well, we did have a diverse pool, but we just went with what we thought was the better fit. I think creating rubrics for interviews makes a big difference because then it becomes less of an amorphous conversation about who you like and who you don't like, but you're actually having qualities you're looking for and checking off those qualities when you see them with examples from their interview and from the interactions you've had for them. Finally, making the case. So understanding what the candidate wants and being creative in what you may be able to offer. Money is important, but it's not the only thing. And so there are lots of other ways to offer candidates what might be helpful to them. And I think it's really been interesting to me in talking to candidates how different that looks like. Like some people just want a little bit of money to help with moving. Some people want to be told that they can attend POCC. Some people want to be able to go to a particular conference that's important to them. So knowing the candidate well enough to understand what you can offer that will really allow them to say yes. Here are some additional strategies to reduce bias in hiring. So we talked about comprehensive rubrics detailing what skills and qualifications you are looking for. It's important to have more than one set of eyes at every stage of the process. So we all bring biases to the table. And the more people you have involved, the more different, you bring more different sets of biases. And so it becomes helpful to have more people involved. And so having policies around, at least 2 or 3 people need to be present at every interview. At least, this entire search team needs to review resumes. All of the places where you only have one person working on it can be stages where bias becomes involved. I think it's important to ask hiring teams to share initial assessments anonymously. So the research has shown that people really can be moved by what they think everybody else wants. So if it looks like everyone wants a particular candidate, people who don't want that candidate are less likely to speak up. And so if there's a way through Google Forms or some other kind of anonymous process to share your initial assessments, you'll get a more accurate understanding of who people prefer. Stick to the rubrics when discussing candidates. So it can be really easy to get off topic, to move into talking about somebody's clothes. I've heard that. Somebody's shoes, somebody's hairstyle, somebody's hometown, what college they went to. But important to stick to the rubrics of what you're looking for to allow less of a chance for that bias to creep in. Be wary of comments around cultural fit, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. Consider removing names, addresses, and schools from resumes. So if you know that you're a school that has a real bias toward people that went to the Ivy League or other kinds of things, consider removing the things that cause bias. We know that there is a famous resume study where researchers sent out identical resumes to employers in Boston and Chicago. The resumes were identical in every way, except for some of them had stereotypically Black names like Jamal and Lakeisha, and others had stereotypically white names such as Greg and Emily. The identical resumes with stereotypically white names received 50% more callbacks, right? So that's an example of the kind of bias that is always at play. So if you know that's happening, consider removing names. But also consider identifying diversity markers that are important to you. So if you are trying to really increase the number of Black men that are at your organization, looking for markers around Black men's organizations, fraternities, other kinds of things, HBCUs, that will help you identify people. Doing the ongoing training and reflection and discussion of the role of bias in hiring, and collecting data on demographic information of candidate pools and finalists so you can assess how you're doing and how you might be improving over time. This next one is a quote from Adriana Herrera where she says, "Culture fit is a signal the company prefers homogeneity over true innovation," right? And that a different term that she prefers is around culture add, a signal that the company values differences for their ability to contribute to the development of authentically innovative solutions that accelerate outcomes. So what is the school trying to do? Are they trying to replicate the culture that they have had for the last 100, 200 years? Or are they trying to change, to grow, to innovate, and to attract people that are different and will bring the school into the future? So it's an important conversation to have. Here are a couple of examples of the kinds of activities you can do with hiring staff. So for example, here's a scenario, right? You are reviewing resumes with your team. A team member says, Wilberforce University, is that even accredited? In what ways might bias play a role? And what can you do or say to interrupt the bias? So feel free to put some thoughts in the chat or to unmute yourself and share how you might respond to those questions. Having trouble seeing the chat. Does anyone have any comments about this one? How you might respond if somebody said that in a resume review meeting?
Well, I just thought to ask the question so it sounds like you've never heard of it. Is that why you are questioning it, because of your ignorance?
Right. So just simply asking the question, right? You haven't heard about this. That doesn't mean it's not accredited, right? And so this was an actual scenario that happened in a resume review that I participated in. Any other thoughts on what you might be able to say? Right. So it is important to practice speaking up in these scenarios. And it's important for not only the diversity director or not only the folks of color to be the ones speaking up, right? In a lot of cultures, it is people shy away from conflict, right? And they don't want to maybe hurt someone or make them feel bad or, offend somebody. But these type of conversations, it's really important to speak up about bias, right? So Wilberforce, historically Black college and university, one of the oldest, historic, a very historic place, one that has produced pretty amazing graduates. And so this kind of questioning of credentials, and I've heard it even around Howard, which is a much more famous university, where our vice president went to, it can really impact whether how fairly different candidates get a shot. And so it's important to speak up. Here's another one that has also, we can see happen quite often. You're interviewing a candidate. The candidate and the division head not only went to the same college, but they participated in the same extracurricular activity, a cappella singing. They talk about the club for a while, and they are both high energy and smiling. You feel that the division head made an instant connection with the candidate and is clearly in favor of him. You see some red flags in the candidate's experience. In what ways might bias play a role? And what can you do or say to interrupt the bias? Oh, there we go. I just stopped the share because I couldn't see what was in the chat. Okay. Right. So what makes you ask that can be a question for the last one. Do you question it because you've never heard of it? We could ask the question, how might we all find out more about this institution of learning? There's a bias of familiarity, right? Asked to develop a set of common questions for all candidates and a rubric by which to evaluate them. Familiarity bias is real, which I interrupt by asking the candidate if he or she can share anything else that helps us assess his or her qualifications for the position. So absolutely, right? So all ways to interrupt what is happening. This is clearly a kind of amazing connection that the candidate is having with the division head, which we value in these schools and tends to be a reason why people move on to the next level. And yet it is an opportunity to return to the rubric and understand what qualities are we looking for, and is this person speaking to those qualities? Any other thoughts? And now that I can see the chat, feel free to put it in the chat. From Annie, asked the division head, how can we focus on their qualifications based on the position requirements? Absolutely. Right. So those are the kinds of questions that can be asked. And I understand that there may be a power differential here, depending on who's in the room. But it is still important to develop the comfort over time to ask these questions and to share the burden to be the one to ask the questions.
I have a question.
Sure.
Can I ask a question?
Sure, Keisha. Sure.
So for the first one with the university, with the bias, I know that you said in the interview you should speak up if there is bias, and you also said that sometimes people don't want to speak up because they don't want to seem as if they are bringing conflict to the situation. So how do you address an issue of bias if you see it happening to you in an interview in a way where it doesn't seem as if you are trying to create any kind of conflict, especially if you are a person of color with interviewing with a white counterpart, because of course there is also the implicit bias or the stereotype of, oh, well, people of color are aggressive and like conflict. So how do you kind of mitigate that kind of situation without coming off as if you're trying to create some kind of conflict, but try to get them to understand that what they're doing is not right?
Thank you for that question. And I apologize, I think I mispronounced your name, but I appreciate the question. So it's a really important point to bring up that people of color are, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, you look frozen to me. All right. That people of color are perceived in a different way than white people, especially when they challenge a situation or allege bias, right? We are seen through the view through their own bias, right? And that often can be as aggressive, as a problem, as someone who always has a problem with something. And so that is something that is important to be aware of. So that, I mean, one, it highlights the importance of why white people need to be trained around bias and why they need to be willing to speak up when it rears its head. But when they don't, and when you have to be the one to speak up, you know, it's the strategies that we always use when we want to be heard, right? Softening your voice, saying something with a smile, being able to speak directly, but with making sure it is heard in a, you know, to speak without a lot of extraneous emotion. And so, you know, it's unfortunate that we have to modulate how we speak in order to be heard. But I think if that's the only option there because the other person is not speaking up about the bias that they see, then those are some strategies that can help. And particularly if you've done some of these practices, like if you take these two scenarios and practice them with the hiring team, then it might even be possible to like, hey, remember when we talked about this scenario? I feel like that's happening here again. Maybe we can redirect and focus more on the rubric, but because this, you know, this is getting a little bit off topic here. So, you know, I think it's the same strategies that you use anywhere to be heard, but I think what's really critical here is the awareness of how different people are perceived when they point out bias and why that means the burden really needs to be shared among everyone in the hiring group. So a hiring team. And so hope that is helpful. With regard to retention, here are a few things I wanted to share. For me, it has been helpful to hire folks in cohorts. And so, you know, particularly if you're a predominantly white institution and these people you hire might be the only one, it is never a good idea to hire that way. Like, how can you hire a couple people of color at the same time who enter in the same year, who can be provided, who can be, you know, you can support them and they can support each other. Creating an affinity group for those new faculty and staff of color in particular, so they can have access to larger affinity groups, but I think it's also helpful for them to have a new faculty and staff of color affinities group in order to navigate the transition in particular ways for what it looks like to them. Around comprehensive onboarding support, it is the biggest feedback I think we hear over and over again from schools across the country, that faculty feel unsupported, right? That they don't feel fully onboarded, that the orientation, the mentoring programs, all of that are not complete, not comprehensive enough, right? And not fully formed enough. And so really thinking about how you can develop that ongoing support in a comprehensive and thorough way. Giving folks a one-on-one time with school leadership so that, you know, these people are new only once, right? And so they have a unique view into your school culture and into the way you do things that is very special, because in a couple of years, they'll just be kind of incorporated into the way you've always done things. And so taking the opportunity to listen to them, to listen to how they did it at their previous school, to listen to what new ideas they have, what fresh perspectives they have. It is a very special opportunity to be able to hear that and also give them the platform to share about their experiences and to offer mentorship to them. And then really, I think it is absolutely critical to attend to school culture. And this might mean that your school isn't ready to hire faculty and staff of color, right? Because if you have a toxic school culture, a school culture that is unfriendly to people of color, it's not going to be fixed by hiring people into it, right? And so then you got to shift culture first, right? And that's an important thing to remember. Because it can be very, very harmful to people to recruit them into that toxic culture and expect them to conform to it. Another thing that is really important is to name cultural norms and values. So many of our schools have been modeled after white middle class norms, but that hasn't been spoken aloud, right? It's just been considered normal. Oh, well, this is how we've always done things for the last 100 years. But those norms are not named and they're not shared, right? So, I mean, this could be anything from something like that's seemingly trivial, such as dress, right? What kinds of dress are considered professional? What kinds of dress are not? If it's not named, it's easy for there to be misunderstandings around it. But it can go much further than that, and even much deeper than that, around, even styles of talking, right? So at one of the schools I worked with, they valued what they called tentative speech, right? Speech that was shared in the form of a question, speech where you might say, instead of saying, I think that's a problem, might we consider if this is the best way to do this? And just understanding that different people from different cultures speak differently and have different patterns of speech. And so if you have a norm of speaking that is accepted that might be a middle class white norm, it's important to, one, identify that norm, talk about it, and share it with your new recruits so that they are not assessed by standards that they're not even aware about. But I think even more important is being receptive to cultural change. So when you hire new people, sure, you hire them because there's an alignment of mission and values. There's an alignment with what your vision for the school is and their own vision for where they want to be and who they are. But it's also important to be receptive to the opportunity to change. New people bring new ways of doing things, new cultures, new ideas, new perspectives, and there's an opportunity for the school to shift and to grow and to change as well. And so being open about that is also part of shifting school culture. As part of that, I wanted to share this document with you, and many of you might have seen it before. I feel like this is something to really be aware of, because it's a dynamic that we have seen at our schools over and over again, and you don't want to recruit people into your organization only for them to go through this cycle, right? And so they talk about the problem woman of color in the workplace. And this might apply to men of color as well. But so first they enter the organization. There's this honeymoon period where the woman of color feels welcomed, needed, happy. People are excited about what she has to offer. And in reality, it tends to be a tokenized hire. Reality begins to set in, particularly when the new employees, the people of color, the women of color, begin to point out issues within the organization and within the school. She tries to work to change those things because she feels like she's trying to support the school to fully live into its mission and values, and pushes for accountability. But the response tends to be extremely negative, right? And particularly when these kinds of challenges, these kinds of critiques are brought by your new faculty of color, the response can be shutting down the person, right? Targeting the person, blaming the person, shifting the responsibility from the school to the people of color, creating divisions among people of color who've been there for a long time and the new arrivals. All of that can happen, and targeting and attacking. And then when eventually the institution decides the woman of color is the problem, they label the conflict as a communication issue, as our culture fit issue, and people tend to leave. So this cycle is one that we see in our schools over and over and over again. And so I think it has become important for us to think about this before hiring, right? To think about what are you going to do when the people you hire who are excellent, right? Because you've made sure of that, are beginning to be called aggressive and angry and off-putting and rude and militant and extreme and hostile and scary and not a good fit. How are you going to protect the people that you've hired and help the school shift their culture as opposed to labeling the people you brought in as the problem? So I'll stop there for a minute and on this document and see if there are any thoughts or responses or questions or resonance with this particular document here that's up on the screen.
This has definitely happened at the school that I'm at. Is we do not, our faculty is not diverse at all. So that's one of the issues. We don't even receive applicants for diverse applications. So we are, that's in our mission statement is, we want to be, become diverse. So that is, but this scenario that this problem women of color is that we have hired a woman of color, and she was, as a teacher, and they, how do you, their team, they team teach. So you have to pair them up with a teacher that's already been at the school and is, and so how do you, make sure, it's not like something we can move teachers around. So they're, I don't know. So how do you work that out? How do you help with that? She did eventually leave. She felt she wasn't, not that she wasn't welcome, that she wasn't used, that she wasn't allowed, I guess, to try different things, or when she did want to try different things, she was, oh, well, that's, no, you're aggressive, you're not a good fit. That's, so.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's such a common experience that so many people have gone through. And so what I'm suggesting is that because we know this is a common experience, can the leadership team of the school or the people responsible for hiring or all of the above sit down with this document, talk about the phenomenon, and talk about like, hey, if we want to hire people, we need to shift our practice so that they can be successful, right? That this is a common experience that people have. And so when I go to feel like this person is aggressive and scary and militant, and to say that to that person and to blame her for all of the problems of the institution, can I remind myself of this document and wonder, am I playing a role in perpetuating this pattern and this cycle? And what can I do differently? And so there's an opportunity for self-reflection and to have some kind of reflective leadership there that will really make the difference. So that's kind of one thing I'm offering to all of you. Any other thoughts or comments on this? So I hear in the chat, all too familiar. It's as if the woman of color is either totally assimilated and proving that she won't show favoritism, or she is embattled, right? No, absolutely. And so there's a couple different categories of how people of color can show up at the school. And that's part of that part down at the bottom where it says people of color are pitted against one another. Because you have, well, what, so-and-so has been here for 40 years and we've never had a problem with her. It's just this new person. And so it becomes really important to try to stave against that kind of divide and conquer, and to really build solidarity among the different communities at your campus. And so that was something that I found helpful. So in this next slide, in terms of the final thoughts I wanted to share with you before I close and maybe we take some comments or questions, is that I believe faculty and staff of color must feel supported. And one of the ways that we did that is by having a really robust faculty and staff of color affinity group. and we met actually every week because it was so needed. And to have some food, to have some opportunity for people to share what they need, what do they need to feel supported, to have people who are willing to show up for them in times of distress and in times of need has been really, really powerful. I think faculty and staff of color must feel valued. They must feel like, they have experience and expertise, and the school knows it, and the school values it, and the school talks about it and celebrates it, and really just kind of puts their arms around this person. And I think we can't underestimate how far that feeling of value goes, right? And honestly, it's little things that make people feel valued. You can learn a little bit more. I would put out a survey for the teachers of color that I worked with, like, what's your favorite treat? So I would know, and I'd be able to bring someone donuts, leave a certain kind of chocolate on someone's desk, leaving personal notes, having those come from the head of school, gift cards for coffee or all of those kinds of things. But the little activities or things that you can do to help people feel valued, even a public recognition. So-and-so created this rubric that we now use for grading this project. It's been really helpful in moving us forward. Or, this was so-and-so's idea. Like, really being able to do that makes all of the difference. And I think faculty and staff of color have to feel like the institution is committed to growth and change, right? So none of our institutions have to be perfect, and they're not. Just like any other institution, all of our institutions are shaped by systemic racism. All of us are acting through our biases. And yet, even though our institutions are not perfect, the people we recruit in them have to know that we are willing to grow and change, that we are willing to face our flaws, that we don't mind getting feedback about the parts of our program that need to be improved. And so that focus on growth and change is something that I've found has been really helpful in letting people feel like they want to stay and that they want to be part of bringing the school fully into living into its mission and values. Finally, here's my contact information. I am here for you. I want to help in any way that you want. This is a personal passion of mine. And the last place it worked, we hired 13 faculty and staff of color in the year that I was there. You got to just go out and do it. I was working around the clock to do it. And to identify people who would be excellent and then recruiting them to your organization. But it makes all the difference for the children. And that's what we are doing this work for. So I will stop my share there. And if there are any final thoughts, questions, comments, I welcome them before we close.
Okay, it's me again. Just to, again, we have no diversity faculty. And so what are some tips, some suggestions on how to, besides, we go to the job fairs, we go where we're in the Midwest. And so we go to the job fairs at the colleges, at the universities. We, advertise, we do what we can. But what are some other tips besides that to try to, and if we're not already diverse, how do we bring someone in, a person of color in, where they don't feel like, well, I don't want to be the only one, I don't want to be, or if it's a token thing, how do we make them feel that we need to get started? We would like to get started. We need to, somebody's got to be the first one on the dance floor. And how do we?
So a couple things, Colette. Thank you for the question. I think first, the previous kind of experience you shared tells me that the stage your school is at with this is focusing on their internal culture. So have you done the trainings around bias and how that's showing up at your school? Have you learned about bias and how it's showing up in your hiring process? Do you understand institutional racism and how that might be showing up on your campus and impacting both employees and students and families? And are you aware of the changes that can happen to the people that to the institution, when you bring in people who are different in whatever way, ideology, color, race, sexuality, gender identity, religion, all of those kinds of things, and are you prepared for the changes that will bring? Or are we going to label the people as problems? And so I think having some of those conversations, doing some of that training is going to be a first step. And then when you're ready to bring people, I really think that cohort model is going to be helpful to you, so that whoever you bring isn't going to be an only, right? That you bring in a couple of people, that you're committed to their growth. You figure out what it is that they want. Do they want to be division head one day? Do they want to be head of school one day? Do they want to run a program, a partnership program with the local public school? Do they want to, be head coach? Figuring out kind of what their greatest aspirations are and how you can support them to reach those dreams at your institution, I think is what's going to make a difference. So those are some thoughts about that.
Thank you.
Sure. I am grateful for your time. Thank you for being in conversation with me, and look forward to hearing about your successes. Take care and have a good night.